Hello, this is Benjamin Boyce, and I found myself on an island right now, but I have content for you, namely an interview with Helen Pluckrose, who is the head editor of Areo magazine. She's also come into somewhat of international infamy with her fellow writers James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian, by those three publishing a number of hoax articles. I know there's a different word than hoax that I'm supposed to use, but they wrote some articles for various academic journals showing the lax standards in these journals. In this particular conversation, we talk about the rise of postmodernism, its interrelationship with Marxism and activism, and various ways that we can, one, undermine this problematic way of thinking, and we get into why it's a problematic way of thinking, and how we can show people an other way of thinking. Some bird wants to talk to us now. A return to Enlightenment values or modern values or postmodern values. So that all being said, I'm going to get down to the beach right now, and here's Helen.
So we finally made it. Are you better now?
Finally. It's been so long in trying to get this to happen, but yeah, we're here. I'm doing good. I'm healing well.
Good.
How are you doing?
Yeah, all is well. Well, I couldn't speak to you for a while because I just lost my dad, but yeah, we're getting on now. I think my brain works again now. Too many projects.
Oh yeah, some of which I'm sure you can't speak of, but I guess one of the things you do is you run Areo. You're like the head honcho there, and you got a project with James and Peter.
Yeah, sort of ongoing work with them and Mike. So there's that, and there's also my book, which I had to take 3 months out of writing, but I've started that again. I'm looking at postmodernism, the scholarship activism which evolved from them over the 80s and 90s, and how it's evolved since: feminist epistemology, critical race epistemology, queer theory, etc., fat activism even, and looking at how this works sort of epistemologically and what the problem is with it compared to the sort of Enlightenment, liberalism and reason and evidence focus.
Is there a way of returning to pre-postmodernism, or are there certain things that have happened because of postmodernism or certain insights that it's brought to bear into the conversation that aren't necessarily going to be reversed, and so we have to kind of redesign the Enlightenment project?
Well, I mean, the Enlightenment project is one that's constantly being redesigned anyway. It was vulnerable to attacks from things like postmodernism, but we've got rationalism and anti-rationalism. We've got evidence-based epistemology and faith-based or subjective epistemologies, and they're constantly pushing at each other, and we just have to make sure that the evidence-based ones win, because it just doesn't work too well otherwise.
Do you think, being generous, that there is a place for, let's not say anti-rationalism, but an irrational viewpoint, or the subjective framework? Does that add to the conversation, or does it only corrode the conversation?
Well, it depends what we're talking about. There isn't anything wrong with talking about how we subjectively experience things. There's only a problem if we're saying that this constitutes a truth, or that the way some people subjectively experience things is more important than the way other people do, and that everybody needs to accept one person's experience as the truth. I mean, sometimes I think postmodernists and the kind of theorists that have evolved from it and aren't really postmodernists, but they've still got that anti-objectivity stance, that constructivist stance, they will present a very sort of simplistic idea of what the rationalists, what the objectivists are doing, in which they're saying we can only have facts, we can only have evidence, nothing else matters. Well, no, it does. We're humans, we're storytelling creatures. We want to think about what is good and what is wise, and we want to draw meaning from narratives. And there are all these wonderful things that we do as humans that bring us great pleasure and great understanding. They're not always evidence-based. The problem is when they are conflated with evidence-based, when we have different kinds of truths. No we don't have different kinds of truth. We have things that are true, and we have things that are experiences, perceptions, opinions. We need to keep those separate. And of course, I'm not saying here that we can ever be completely sure that we have attained objective truth, but that is always the aim. Getting closer to it, it should always be the aim.
It seems like there is a bug in the works where the postmodernist project goes off the rails to a certain degree. And in charting it and in investigating its growth, have you recognized like the mistake that's made early on in one's transition from rationalism to anti-rationalism, and why is it so attractive to go down that path?
Well, I think the thing is, with the first postmodernists in the late 60s, it wasn't really attractive to that many people. They were very, very niche. They suddenly popped up at the same time in these various sort of different disciplines of academia, and they pushed back against the Enlightenment ideal. They pushed back against Marxism, against Christianity, and against science, against all the things which claimed to know what was true. And they claimed that truth is not something to be found, it is something to be made, that it's always constructed. Now, because this was so aimless, really, because it just wanted to deconstruct things, it didn't really have anywhere to go, and it kind of dismantled itself. And then we had in the 80s and the late 80s and the early 90s, we had feminists and critical race theorists and other people saying, and queer theorists, for example, saying, well, okay, this postmodernism thing is good, cultural constructivism is a thing, but unless we accept that there are certain people in certain places having certain experiences and this is real, we can't do anything. So we saw then a return to some form of objectivity, but that was when we're looking at society and how it's structured. So it's objectively true that society is structured in terms of systems of privilege, but that those privileges have been culturally constructed and still need to be deconstructed. So it really is a very kind of second wave, and this is why people so often say, well, postmodernism is dead, nobody's doing it anymore. And they're not. Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, they wouldn't recognise what is happening now, but those ideas have been taken from their sort of key tenets about objectivity, about discourse, about language, about structures. Sorry, I go on.
No, I love that you go on. You're a wonderful goer oner. One thing that Jordan Peterson brings up time and again is this quizzical, this problem that he has with why is Marxism enshrined in postmodernism. And I think that you're kind of pointing towards that. Like, if postmodernism is to destroy every meta-narrative, then why is it embraced Marxism as the meta-narrative? And there's an inherent contradiction in that. But what you're pointing to is that postmodernism needs some sort of narrative, some sort of objectivity, which I think is more projectivity than anything else.
We still have the Marxists. They have formed in academia a type of scholarship, a materialist approach. It claims to be empiricist, although it has a kind of conspiracy theory mentality in the way it reads things. And it is at odds with the postmodernists, who are the discourse analysts, and they're looking at how things are constructed in language. And we see within feminism, within critical race theory, within post-colonialism, the Marxist scholars and the postmodern scholars really at odds with each other. Mm-hmm. And so I think when we're looking at Marxism, I mean, Foucault, for example, he reacted quite strongly against Marxism. He was accused of being a conservative, as I expect you know, by Habermas. And then we have Derrida, when he wrote his Spectres of Marx, in which he stated the one thing that is perfectly clear is that I am not a Marxist. And so we are looking at, with postmodernism, a reaction against Marxism, but it didn't turn away from socialism. So we still have the same drivers underneath. I like to think of Marxism and postmodernism as having a common ancestor, both philosophically and economically, but they've gone different directions. And I think it's profoundly unhelpful to confuse Marxism and postmodernism, because what is the problem? At the root of the problem with postmodernism is they don't think that there is a truth, and if we start looking for postmodernists to say Marxist things, that's not going to happen. They're not going to address the economy. They're not going to care about the working class, because too many of the working class are straight white men. So we can see some similar attitudes and some similar attributes, but Marxism and postmodernism really are very separate things.
Okay. Why was the Academy susceptible to postmodernism?
Well, I think at this time, at the late 60s, because Marxism had been a failure and there was a gap to be filled with the leftist academics, in which they are still governed by these sort of left and liberal drives to the Care Harm Foundation, to help the most vulnerable to achieve social justice. So there was this move then after the wars, after the fall of empire, after the fall of Jim Crow, when everybody is looking at how much social injustice there has been. We've got the civil rights movements going on. And by the time we're getting into the end of the 70s, the 80s, legally most of the injustices have been repaired. It's no longer allowable to discriminate against people on the grounds of their race or sex. Gay men can now have sex legally. So a lot of these things had been repaired, and what was left was a lot of attitudes. So just because we had gender equality laws enshrined, and racial equality, it didn't mean that sexism and racism had gone away. Feminists and anti-racists and LGBT activists were still focused on addressing social attitudes, and this is where postmodernism, with its social constructivism in language, comes in very handily. So the postmodernism, it kind of rose up in the late 60s, and then it burned itself out by the 80s. But by this time, the civil rights movements were seeing diminishing returns, and the new social justice activism has tagged on to the end of the civil rights movements, because we've got a zeitgeist in which we still really are newly aware of exploitation, of oppression, of empire, of colonialism, of sexism, of racism, and we want to keep addressing these. So that sort of culmination of the end of the civil rights movement, the evolution of postmodernism, came together all at once to produce what we're seeing now as social justice, scholarship and activism.
So one of my ideas that came from my studying of the Evergreen situation was exactly what you say, is that the civil rights movement came and went, and then you have a bunch of basically boomers who are yearning for that time of like drastic change and of great movements and being swept up and like really confronting these big problems. But the big problems get smaller and smaller with time. And so there's this mismatch between the desire for a grand change and the very nuanced, tiny ways in which injustices still occur. So, for example, you have microaggressions still occurring, but when somebody goes to correct the microaggression, they bring the full brunt of the righteousness against a major aggression, right? So it seems like the energy is not suited to the correction. The correction is small little details, when the energy and the mobilization, the activism wants the grand narrative.
Yes, I think that's probably quite true. I haven't quite thought about it in those terms, but yeah, I mean there is something to it. That the idea of microaggressions, we do commonly make assumptions that you're a man, you're likely to do this. You're a woman, you're whatever your identity is. There are things we connect with it, and that can be very annoying for people who don't fit into this and who find themselves subject to these expectations. But the idea that's coming from the sort of discourse analysis is this idea that we need to really dig into it, that we need to uncover it, that we need to admit it, that we need to dismantle it. And there just isn't any evidence that constantly pointing at things which could be racist, which could be sexist, is actually helping more than the liberal approach which was working before. Because we have, with mainstream liberalism, as Kimberly Crenshaw called it, or universal liberalism, we had this drive to remove social significance from identity categories. So you are still a man, but now you shouldn't be expected to fight, to hunt, to do all these things associated with men. So to change expectations that people aren't constrained into them, remove barriers. Now the social justice approach is very different. It starts with the assumption that in any interaction between people of two different identities, there's going to be power imbalance, and they try to read where it is. And so then they think by uncovering this, we will become more aware of it, we will be in a position to dismantle it. But what seems to be happening, and what has been found with anti-bias training and things, is the more that we point out race and gender, the more entrenched antagonism seems to be. And we've seen, on the other hand, attitudes improving so quickly. The number of people, for example, who said they'd be happy to live next door to someone of a different race, that suddenly just went up from something like 39% to 95%. I think that was the UK, was it? And that was and within about 30 years. So that really is incredibly rapid. But if we're now going back again to judging people by their gender, their race, their sexuality, my fear, and a fear of a lot of people who are looking into this, is that it's going to cause the problem to reoccur. We're going to see much more racism and sexism and homophobia is going to appear much more natural again. We had this nice sort of rule that we didn't do that, and now that seems to be becoming unsettled.
It seems so obvious to me that that would be the backlash, and yet we have people who are very highly trained and at least bureaucratically very intelligent, and intelligent insofar as they can get a PhD, going down this path and inciting racism and inciting, discrimination against all sorts of categories. But it's okay discrimination because we're only discriminating against the majority. We're only discriminating against the historically advantaged. It just seems so obvious that that's such a bad path to go down. And yet when you bring that up, like with you guys, what you've done and what you and James and Peter have been showing has received a drastic backlash from the people who are trying to do all this good work. And why do you think they can't see that? Or am I wrong to think that they should know better?
Well, what seems so natural to you, and I do believe it is obvious to most people, because the way that we work generally is on a sense of fairness and reciprocity. We want principles to apply to everyone. But what is coming up now really doesn't work that way, and that is why it's so counterintuitive. It's a completely different conception in which we are seeing people plotted by their identity into a position in society. There are hierarchies and there are structures of power and privilege, and so it makes no sense at all to say that everybody should be treated the same. Straight white men have been advantaged. Their knowledge is the one that forms society. They need to sit down and shut up and let women and people of colour and trans people and LGBT people generally to put forth their knowledge, which will be different, and to be heard. So it makes no sense to say there needs to be a fairness. Nobody should be discriminated against because of their identity, because they're seeing things in a kind of reversal of this hierarchy. And
so I understand why they're justified in that. And you've been doing a lot of work to diagnose this problem, and you're showing it, the outcome of this in different disciplines in academia. I've been showing this with what happened at Evergreen, trying to connect the dots for people. These were the ideas, and these are the actions, and they're intimately linked. They're a 1-to-1 ratio. This is the outcome of thinking this way. So beyond the diagnosis, and we should talk more about the diagnosis and what it is and how it goes on, but have you started to grapple, and what are your thoughts on how do we reverse that, or how do we challenge that in a fruitful manner? And is it possible, or is society just, we're going to have to sweat this out?
I think it's entirely possible, because I think, a few minutes ago you said that isn't it obvious that we should all be treated the same? And I still truly believe that this is how the vast majority of people think. What is causing a problem with the left in addressing the problem on the left? We all see the problem on the right. If the far right is saying, well, these people should have rights and these people shouldn't, we should privilege these people over these people, it's clear the problem. We don't see it when it's on the far left, and that's because it's happening in the name of social justice. So there are all these very sort of well-meaning liberal lefties who don't want to seem to be against social justice, who don't want to criticise anti-racist activism, feminism, LGBT activism. So they're not addressing it out of a kind of misguided loyalty, but there's also a failure to address it because it's just so counterintuitive and hard to understand. So, to you, to me, to nearly everybody, this seems hypocritical. It seems inconsistent. It seems like a big mess. And I think that people really need to understand the thinking that's behind it. And when you can get into that mindset, then you can compare epistemologies and you can say, well, no, we don't want this one. We don't think that's going to help. There isn't evidence that it's going to help. We want consistent principles applied to everyone. That doesn't mean that we think there's a level playing field already, but we think we could get there much better if we have consistent principles. And I think people are ready to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you're kind of at the forefront, and I see you, at least on Twitter, which is one of the ways that I see you interacting with the world, attracting combativeness and then challenging people and being pretty consistent in your narrative and attracting kind of ruffled feathers and stuff. And how's your kind of attitude towards the social justice contingent changed over time? Do you feel kind of in a pitted battle with them? Do you feel empathy towards them? And what are some of the strategies that you've seen have reduced the aggression against this kind of conversation?
Well, I think with a lot of the social justice people, the identitarian left, if you're going to find common ground with them at all, the way to achieve that is to recognise that is what they're running for, because they seem racist and sexist, but in reverse to the way we've historically understood racism and sexism, it is quite easy to accuse them of being ill-motivated. But if you say to them, well, I understand, that is also my aim. Wherever there is inequality, wherever there is a lack of opportunity, I also want this. And we can occasionally find some common ground here, but it's quite difficult because of this narrative that people like me, typically socially, economically left-wing liberals, are trying to maintain a status quo because it benefits me as a white woman. And I either don't know that I'm complicit in structural racism, or I don't care, and I'm trying to perpetuate it because it benefits me. So if somebody is talking to me with that in their mind, the chances of them finding any common ground with me or accepting that I actually share a considerable number of their aims is very, very small.
Yeah. That seems to be like one of the features of this mentality. And I spoke with Brett Weinstein a year and a half ago about kind of around the grievance studies and how that kind of grew up. And he told kind of evolutionary narrative about it, about there's all these different ways of acting that were selected over time that cause it to be such a strong ideology and reinforce that ideology. And a lot of the weird behaviors that I see seem to be a part of this this mind virus or this ideology that just sweeps people up and makes it rather cult-like or rather religious in a negative sense. And so the whole process of somebody waking up from their wokeness or being deprogrammed, it can't be done through a face-to-face conversation. It has to happen from the inside out. This is what I've seen. People have to like be thrown out of the cult, or like just hit a brick wall with the mentality. But maybe there are other ways of going about that, or maybe the job is to speak to people who are curious or who are sympathetic, and just very patiently lay out like the end game and the narrative.
I mean, I think when somebody really is deeply embedded in the ideology, reaching them through conversation is very, very difficult. But I also think that they're a much smaller proportion of society than we perceive them to be. I think it was it 8% of people said that they approved of political correctness, identity politics approaches. But what we have on top of that is the well-meaning liberals on the left, and also to a certain extent on the right, who are validating and supporting these ideas because they want to be in favour of social justice. I think if we can win the battle of ideas, if we can make it evident that social justice activism is no such thing, it's not at all likely to result in social justice, and it's likely to do considerable harm, and it's ridiculous, and more people are saying this openly, then we have a situation of social pressure. At the moment, to be a social justice activist is to be virtuous, is to get... You get a lot of attacks, obviously, from people on the right and even people on the left, but you're really morally virtuous and at the top of the pile there. If we've got a situation where the majority of the left is saying, no, you are our extremists, you are irrational, you are counterproductive, we distance ourselves from you, then it's going to be far less attractive for young people to go into in the first place. And I think this is the way the battle of ideas are won, not in the short term, but in the long term. And I'm hopeful that we have done something towards that, because after our probe came out, there were some scholars on the left who, they still hated us, obviously, but they were distancing their own work from the kind of work that we were mimicking, that we were mirroring, and they were defending the empirical nature of their work, the sort of the rigorous methods that they use, and that was brilliant. That was exactly what we wanted. If we can marginalise these postmodern ideas, these postmodern ethics, then that the problem will take care of itself.
That's brilliant. And it's kind of ironic that, like you said, it's the well-meaning liberals, give or take, left-right spectrum, but it's the well-meaning people who are allowing the extremists to wield so much power and have such a strong voice and to kind of dictate the conversation. Because I've seen that critique against the well-meaning liberal from the radicals. Like, they're always denigrating the well-meaning liberal, and they trot out this quote by Martin Luther King, where I think he wrote a letter from jail, and he calls out the white liberals who never stand up, who just passively allow injustice to occur. So it seems like the way that the radicals are going about mobilizing or silencing the well-meaning liberal is going to be fundamentally different than the way in which you or somebody on the left would kind of try to get them to stand up and hold their ground and call out the radicals by not shaming them. Because what the radicals have is the power of shame. They have these words that are quickly becoming meaningless: bigotry, homophobia, racism. They call you all these terms, and they call everybody those terms that just doesn't agree with them. So if the alternative to that is that, no, you're well-meaning and that's good, and we're not going to shame you, but you need to hold your ground and not be a coward, I guess there's a way of framing it that's more inspiring than kind of shaming.
Yeah, I did try. In my piece, no, liberal lefties are not right wing. I ended it with a request for liberal lefties to defend liberal leftism, because it's been the norm, the cultural norm for so long. We've sort of lost the ability to defend the need for evidence, the need for reason, the need for consistent principles. And people aren't doing this because they're just so confused about what is happening on the far left anyway, and they don't really often understand what it is they need to defend, or how to do that without being called racist or sexist or homophobic. And James and I, we wrote our manifesto against the enemies of modernity. And that addressed both the far left and the far right, and pointed out that, well, argued that the majority of people are neither, and that we all, in the middle here, I mean, I'm not talking about political centrism, I'm talking about people who are not extremists. We generally like and want to maintain the benefits of secular liberal modernity. We like our institutions, we like our human rights, we like science, we like reason. And we're taking these for granted. We need to not do that. We need to learn how to look at extremist arguments from all sides and say, well, this is the problem with this. Here's the ethical problem with this. Here's the epistemological problem with this. So James and Peter and I, we are breaking things down time and time again, and we are saying, what's the epistemology going on here? What's the ethics going on here? Are these things that we want to maintain in society? And generally, I think at least 80% of people would say no. That's not what we want. We want some consistency. We want some evidence-based epistemology. We want rigor. So that is what we're hoping for. Anyway, to just really try and articulate what it is that we need to defend at the moment. And it's not being racist or not being sexist. It's being consistent, and it's being reasonable.
Do you think that that's an outcropping of us just becoming soft from the benefits of society, the benefits of, I guess, modern society has allowed us to take advantage of these things? And then some of us go a little crazy because we think that everything is constructed so we can just mix and match and it'll have the same result. Where other people say, we don't have to defend anything. Like, the status quo is A-okay. We don't need to stand up for it. It'll perpetuate beyond us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a strong hypothesis that one of the reasons that we're seeing so much, as you described earlier, overreaction to small events, is that we haven't, most of us in our lifetimes, had to deal with any large events. If we were at war, then we might not care too much if somebody touched somebody else's hair or said they were articulate or asked them to make the tea. So, yes, there is, I think, that's where we are looking at what are the worst injustices in society. And when there aren't that many of them, when we're not battling fascism or communism or any totalitarian regime, then we're digging into things which are really quite nebulous and interpretive. So, yeah, somebody said, I can't remember who it was, that the only thing that will save us now is if aliens attack. Then we will pull together and rediscover our common humanity. And but I think we can manage that without that.
Do you think, or are you optimistic about humanity's ability to work cooperatively without a common enemy? Do you think that there's such a thing as like a truly common humanity identity politic, or do we need, from your point of view, do you think we're always going to need tribalism? We're always going to need some sort of warfare, whether it's petty warfare or internecine conflict?
I think it'll take a long time of peace and harmony for evolution to change our brains out of the territorial, tribal aspects that we've had so long that predate our humanity. I don't know if that is ever possible, but what has worked to sort of mitigate it as much as possible is the kind of structure that came up in modernity, that evolved, that came through the Enlightenment and the civil rights movements, where it really is a social construct. We started to disapprove of judging people by their identity and of giving some people more rights than other people. And this is really quite counterintuitive to us. We are tribal, we are territorial. If we get this norm and we find that it works, it benefits everyone, then we really need to hold on to it and keep reinforcing it, because otherwise I think our nature is just far more inclined to retreat into groups and to prefer one's own group, I mean ideological or racial or gender or whatever, over other groups. And that's that's something that I don't think we will ever overcome before our extinction. We just have to get systems in place to mitigate it, to do the best we can with it.
Have you been aware of your own leanings, and is there like a continued sustained practice on your behalf of resisting your own tribal nature, or like at least being aware that you might have blind spots because you're inclined to favor those who favor you?
I do. Of course, I think we do all have biases. It's been noted before, and I admit to it, that I have a certain sympathy with the socialists, the Marxists, the materialists. I think that they are wrong in their analysis of society, but I share their aims. My leftism comes from the socialist left, and I have, over time, accepted that a capitalist system actually does work better for everyone. And so I have to now hope for a kind of for progressive taxes, for social programs, for this kind of social democracy rather than socialism. So I have socialists who can tolerate me, who think I'm generally in the right place, but getting quite misguided. And I think the same of them. So I do have a sympathy with them. We also share an antipathy to the postmodern left, which we feel has really sort of shifted the focus away from the working class people and taken it into elite universities and become about everything else other than economics and class things. So I am aware of having that bias, certainly. I'm also tend to have some prejudice against social conservatives and religious conservatives, perhaps which might not always be fair. So I have to try and watch that. But I think we all have these, and I just try to stay true to principles as far as I can.
Yeah. So the principle, do you think that there's certain principles that can override bias, or at least mitigate the negativity or the growing of bias? Like, how do you keep an open mind towards a religious conservative?
Well, I think that's the good thing of liberalism. I don't have to. I can disagree with a social conservative or religious conservative completely and have really strong arguments with them at the same time as defending their right to be socially conservative or religiously conservative and say so.
I'm sure that you've received some criticism about people kind of construing your work with grievance studies as being imminently weaponizable by the right. And what do you think about that? What do you think about, like, you developing tools that could end up actually damaging the project that you do believe in and stand for?
I think this is always a risk, but unfortunately we cannot fix problems on our own side without acknowledging that they exist. And what I've said to people who've said this before, what gives you more confidence? If you think of a group that you really disagree with, that say conservatives, if a conservative is honestly owning the extremists on their own side, if they are critical of Trump, for example, if they are acknowledging the rise of white nationalism and they are having a problem with it, isn't that could certainly give ammo to the left. But in fact, I think it gives more confidence that there is a respectable, a reasonable and ethical conservative position to have on things. In the same way, I've often thought with Muslim reformers, they're accused of feeding into anti-Muslim bigotry. But in fact, I think knowing that there are Muslim liberals, Muslim reformers who are criticising the extremists in their own group, who are acknowledging them and they're trying to do something about them, actually it makes much more positive view towards Muslims, because we know that they vary greatly and that there are liberal Muslims out there. And I think this is the same with the left. It's not as though if I don't point out postmodernism and social justice activism and inconsistency, that no one's going to notice. People have noticed. What it needs is for those of us on the left to address it honestly, to get more and more of us to address it, to say this doesn't represent all of us. We see the problem. We are working on it. Please come back and vote left.
Interesting. So in a certain respect, it almost requires faith that the people on the other side of the aisle are respectable and are honorable and will recognize respectability and honor in somebody who's their opponent or on the other side of the aisle. So you have to have faith that you're going to be seen as a liberal at the end of when everything shakes out. You're still a liberal by people who are conservative.
Yeah, but I think people who are dyed-in-the-wool conservatives, they're not going to vote left no matter what, and unless the right really goes too far away from their values. But what we have is a huge number of people in the middle. We know, for example, in the US, in the UK, that left-leaning parties will be voted in one time and then right the next. That shows that there are always people going back and forth. For Trump, for example, I mean, he has garnered so much legitimate criticism. How much would it take for the left to increase its respectability, increase its credibility to reasonable people to ensure that he doesn't have a second term? I don't think it would take that much. And I think that this is really what the left needs to be doing. It needs to be reaching out to those waverers. There's nothing to be gained from being a political purist and saying, well, you've voted for a racist, a sexist, whatever, you're dead to us. No, we need to bring people back. People haven't suddenly become sexist or racist. The situation has changed. The left has lost credibility, and it needs to win it back.
It's just very fascinating, or ironic, take your pick, that the party of tolerance is the one that's exuding the most intolerance at this point. The people who are so concerned with care are so careless with who they call bigots. And do you think that folds into the activism plus postmodernism kind of mentality? Like just how venomous the left has become, or at least the far left has become?
Yes, I think we've got heroes and villains and victims and oppressors now, and it's very difficult for somebody who is embedded in this mindset where they see this oppressive system and a certain group of people perpetuating the oppression to have any sympathy for those people at all. I mean, the idea that nearly all of us want to be good people, we want to make a fair society. We're not sitting there thinking, well, how can I oppress and exploit large sections of the population today? It doesn't seem to occur to them. It doesn't seem to occur to them that you want to argue with them, that you want to say this isn't fair and this is why it isn't fair. They should, well, no, you are just obviously evil, and that's a difficult mindset to do anything with. And that's one of the things that's so toxic about it.
It's just how do you detoxify that? It just seems very immature. It seems like somebody is stunted in their intellectual growth or has regressed in their intellectual growth to not be able to, give the benefit of the doubt and operate in good faith, to use a term that's quickly becoming a dog whistle. But
as I said, I don't think that those. I just think there are fewer who are really ideologically committed than we think there are. Okay. I think there are far more waverers, and we can win them back. Whether how to get through to and deprogram the cultists, as you accurately described them earlier, I don't know. Maybe maturity will do that. Some of them are very young. Some of them aren't, though.
So with Areo as a platform, this is kind of a technical question or a geeky question because this is about publishing and stuff. What's your idea of where it's going to go, and what role do you want it to have in society? It's kind of a sibling or a cousin of Quillette. And it's one of those outlets like Reason that's out there that's could possibly be a crossroads for certain sorts of discourse that would be more beneficial rather to one party or another party, but just to the discourse itself. What's your conception of it?
That's the aim. Yeah, I mean, Areo is essentially humanist, and it is reason and evidence based. So we have a few sort of zero tolerance rules. So we're not going for partisan arguments, political speaking points, hyperbole. We don't want obscure theoretical or psychoanalytical or religious arguments. We want evidence and reason. We want an attempt to be charitable, to be balanced. So people can be left-wing, and we have some very left-wing writers, or they can be right-wing, and we have a few of those, and they can argue for those positions, but they need to be essentially humanists, which means they need to care about humanity generally. So they don't have to be atheists, and many of them aren't, but there's this idea that Areo writers are broadly humanist, broadly liberal, in that not left-wing sense, but in that sense of seeking a fairness and freedom and equality generally. So we've got, Quillette, it has been said, is the natural home of the intellectual dark web. We are a bit more sort of, we have a lot of the old new atheists, and so we have these sort of objectivists, this evidence, this reason, this humanism sort of thing going on, but our writers are so diverse. We've had a theologian write for us. We've had so many conservatives, even more socialists. So we're anything that's a good argument, that's reasoned well, and which doesn't call everyone who disagrees with you evil, is something we want to put out there.
Do you think that arguments like that can be designed in such a way to make them more infectious than the bickering kind of call-out culture kind of stuff? Or do you just have to take the high road and lose a lot of audience in taking the high road?
I think it's the latter, to be honest. I know from looking at publications, if page views, if we've got something which really appeals to one section of society, either the right or the left, for example, my criticism of intersectional feminism, that's the one, loads and loads of page views. Then we have something which is much more measured, and it's looking at sort of a more sort of just giving some credit to both sides or something, and we have way fewer. So I could increase our reading by being particularly at one side of the spectrum, and that would certainly improve our page views. But we're not going to do that, and I think there is a market for people who are sick of that, for people who want to see different arguments from both sides, but from reasonable and balanced people on both sides.
Yeah. We can fall into the trap of bemoaning the whatever it is, this media, the Guardian, the Huffington Post, and now the New York Times, for publishing these very incendiary op-eds and going after white people or men constantly. And it's really easy to bemoan the fact that that's what's driving views. Whether it's a hate view or it's a love view, it's still driving views, and it's degrading discourse over time. And so in taking the high road, you have to kind of give up the populist, but have more faith in the population, in a sense, that people will either get tired of this or eventually get around to reading this kind of material.
Yeah, and we build up quite a community of thoughtful people who bring in other thoughtful people, and I think that's certainly worth doing. We're getting a bit heavy on academics at the moment, so I'm trying to get some more
what do you want, porn stars?
Non-academics. Well, yeah, they can certainly write for us, but I want us not to become too dense and philosophical and
What's the status with the gender, well, not the gender, it's more than just gender studies, but the Grievance Studies project that you guys did? Are you guys just watching it fall out?
Yeah, we're still obviously following developments. We have Mike Naina, who is making the film. We'll all continue to read, write, make arguments about what is happening in academia. We sort of have various plans in mind to sort of dig into things a bit more and where we're going to go now. But I have my book, obviously, in which I want to just really set everything out for anybody who can cope with reading 90,000 words on on this kind of scholarship. And yeah.
Do you think it was a success?
We shall see where we can go. Yeah, and it would have been better if we'd have been allowed to finish, to be honest. But we knew that would probably happen once there was suspicion and we were being asked questions. We'd said we would come clean. We wouldn't lie to people or refuse to come clean when we were being asked. So we had to do that with 7 papers still in play. But it was a bit of a blow because we'd kind of mastered the masculinities and the gender aspect, and we'd got some critical race theory in there, but we were just perfecting and getting good at some other things which were progressing positively, some of the queer theory and some of the psychoanalytic stuff. And yeah, that could have worked. So it would have been nice to have had a bit longer to finish off, but yeah. I think generally it showed what we wanted to show. But in another way, what we didn't really think of is because it's so complicated and people just really aren't going to take the time to read not only our 10,000 word explanation of what we did, but all our papers and follow all the references and look at all the reviewer comments. And you'd really need to do that to understand what it was what the whole body of scholarship that we drew from and how we were directed to go. It would take, a committed person 3 months or something to get a good idea of that. And that's not going to happen. So we're, a bit frustrated with people who have read a few news articles about it and they're sure they knew what we did and what it meant, and they really don't.
In a certain respect, these studies that you guys critiqued from the inside out are so obscure. Because they're so obscure and so dense and so complex and so specialized, that in a way is what allowed them to grow so big, or to go as far as they have gone and to fly under the radar, because they're all in these little coteries of people publishing themselves and adulating themselves and never having to be exposed to data, to the outside world, or to basically to any sort of scrutiny. Maybe I'm overstating the case.
But no, it is a self-reinforcing, self-feeding system. Jim and I have just finished writing something we're going to publish soon, which is looking at how these common themes are all sort of building on each other. When you've got Robin DiAngelo with her white fragility, and to support that, then you need Jose Medina and his epistemic ignorance, and then we have Alison Bailey and her privilege preserving epistemic pushback. We have white ignorance, we have white talk, we have all of these ideas that are coming up, and they're mutually reinforcing each other, and nothing is really coming in to say, well, what is at the base of this? What is this rooted in, and is it the right way to look at things? Because it's all based on this assumption of a standpoint epistemology by identity, and it's authorizing, legitimizing each other.
And so do you see going forward that people will be held accountable intellectually to actually base their ideas and their theories on reality? Or do you think they'll just be able, they've mastered the art and they've mastered the bureaucracy to just perpetuate until colleges close because the bubble has burst?
I think that the people who are already doing this will continue to do this, but I still think the majority of people won't do this, and all we can do really is try to get fewer and fewer people holding this kind of scholarship in high regard and being willing to study it. There's also the reality that few people are going to want to employ someone whose degree is in something like this. It really can only be useful for being a diversity officer or for teaching it itself. And unfortunately, that role is growing at the moment. But I think it will burn itself out. I think it will fall out of favour, but I don't know how long that will take and how much damage it will do in the meantime.
Yeah. What happened at Evergreen State College is, I haven't done this yet, but I can pretty much guarantee that Robin DiAngelo and her ideas were very, very instrumental. Like if that book, White Fragility, had been on the press by the time it happened, that would have been the Little Red Book of the uprising. And hopefully at some point, either myself or somebody else can go through and show the direct correlation between her ideas and what happened at Evergreen. Because I'm really scared that her ideas will be enshrined by, Starbucks and like all these big corporations, and then kind of like start being taught at high schools and stuff like that. And I think her ideas are some of the worst I've seen to pop up in this century.
This is the thing that Jim and I have just finished writing in order to support a short documentary made by Mike. So this is what we're trying to do, is show the connection between these ideas, this mind virus, as you said, and the actions. I can certainly, if you want to just completely despair of humanity, though, I recommend reading Barbara Applebaum's Being White, Being Good, White Complicity and Pedagogy or something. But I've read that one. That one infected my mind. I read her and Jose Medina in one day, both of their books, and it played with my mind. I found myself watching a video, and it was just a film in which a girl graduated, a scene, a mixed race girl graduated, and she was celebrating with her parents, and she hugged her white mother. And I'd just finished reading these books, and I thought, oh look, she loves her mother even though her mother's white. I thought, what are you thinking? And it kind of gets into your brain, and you stop seeing, well, here's a girl and here's her mother and her father. Here's a mixed race person, a white person, a black person. What power dynamics are going on here? It's horrible. It's anti-humanist, and it's very difficult to avoid it if you're entrenched in that. And I'm one of the most sort of universally liberal, skeptical people you can find, and it really did mess with my mind for quite some time. Yeah. I had to read Stephen Pinker to straighten to wash my brain out. He's very good for that, and he needs to write more.
No, I noticed that too. I'm still very much affected by my Evergreen education, and it's not so bad. It's just I'm always critiquing TV, and I'm always seeing the power dynamics, and I'm always seeing representation. And it's not that I'm just seeing representation. I'm always skeptical of why that representation's there. I can never just consume the media, which is, I guess, a good thing. Your eyes are open and they're never closed. But I've had to do some active work to not be projecting that all the time, and not being like apologetic all the time about my status as with the chromosome and the phenotype that I have. Well, excellent, Helen. Thanks so much for finally getting on my channel. It's not you, it's our schedules, but we did it finally. We can celebrate.
Yes, finally.
Have a good night.
Oh.
Did I?
You're breaking up.
I was just saying good night.
Okay. Good night.
Good night, Helen. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.